History portrays Edward VI as the feeble and ultimately doomed son of Henry VIII. But the truth is so much darker. Edward was every bit as twisted as his rotund father, and his gruesome end was likely a blessing for England. The birth of Edward VI was probably the greatest moment in Henry VIII's life. The rotund king desperately wanted a son, but it took 28 years, 2 daughters and 3 wives to finally make it happen. To say people were excited would be an understatement. One chronicler described the infant Edward as the most beautiful boy that ever was seen. However, England couldn't celebrate for long. Tragedy soon marred the joyous occasion. Queen Jane Seymour couldn't take part in the celebrations along with everyone else. It soon became clear that the birth had taken a serious toll on her. Within days, she was hanging by a thread. Seymour fought for a little over a week before succumbing to her illness. Edward VI never got to meet his mother, and let's just say the boy definitely needed all the motherly guidance he could get. Edward VI grew up without a mother, but here's the thing, he basically grew up without a father too. Sure, Henry VIII was over the moon that he finally had a son. That doesn't mean he was actually going to spend any time with the boy. Henry sent Edward away pretty much from the moment he was born, and aside from one brief visit when Edward was 1, he almost never saw the boy for the first several years of his life. Sure, Henry didn't actually spend any time around Edward, but he still spoiled the heck out of the kid. He called his son this whole realm's most precious jewel, and had his attendants treat him accordingly. Edward's apartments had to be kept spotless at all times. They had insane levels of security, and of course, they included all the finest toys and luxuries money could buy. Edward even had his own personal minstrel troupe, for crying out loud. Now, I know what you're thinking. Spoiling a kid rotten rarely turns out well. Well, Edward was no different. The boy was quickly growing into a little terror. Edward had plenty to keep him busy, with intensive studies along with the manly fencing and horseback riding that Henry insisted upon. But between all that, Edward still found time to pick up a dark pastime: sorcery. Among Edward's mountain of toys, he kept a sinister red box filled with tools of sorcery. He and his older sister Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, both had a strange obsession with magic and astrology, and Lord knows what they got up to with those tools. But while Edward and Elizabeth liked to cast spells together, that was nothing compared to Edward's relationship with his other sister, the infamous Bloody Mary. Edward absolutely adored his eldest sister Mary, once writing "I love you the most" to her when he was 9 years old. It makes sense. Mary was over 2 decades older, and with no mother and an absent father, she was the closest thing to a parental figure Edward had. But, just like his father, Edward's moods could change quickly, and before long, Edward and Bloody Mary would become bitter enemies. Give Edward VI credit for one thing. He was the only person on Earth who seemed capable of making Henry VIII act like a decent human being. Henry had long since disinherited both of his daughters, and divorced/beheaded their mums. But having a son softened him. In 1543, he invited all 3 of his kids to spend Christmas with him. For most families, that seems pretty normal, but for the Tudors, it was completely unheard of. Life in the Tudor family seemed downright normal for maybe the first time ever. But of course, it couldn't last long. That pleasant Christmas dinner took place at a high point in Henry VIII's life. Not only was his son everything he'd dreamed of, but Edward had even solved one of Henry's biggest problems. Henry brokered a deal with Scotland for Edward to marry the 7-month-old Mary, Queen of Scots. With that deal, Henry set himself up to finally get Scotland under English rule after centuries of conflict. A son and Scotland? It seemed like nothing could go wrong for Henry VIII. So of course, that's when everything went wrong. Ironically, right around the time Henry, Edward, Mary and Elizabeth all enjoyed their nice Christmas dinner together, the Scots backed out of the marriage treaty. To say Henry was furious doesn't quite cover it. He flew into a wild rage and sent Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, north to teach the Scots a lesson. His instructions were utterly horrifying. Henry VIII told Seymour to burn Edinburgh town, so razed and defaced when you have racked and gotten what ye can of it, as there may remain forever a perpetual memory of the vengeance of God lightened upon them for their falsehood and disloyalty. Seymour did Henry proud and set about on an utterly vicious campaign in Scotland. Who knows how history would have turned out if Edward VI had married Mary, Queen of Scots, but it didn't happen. Honestly, I would consider Mary lucky. I wouldn't exactly call Edward marriage material. Henry VIII created his own religion just so he could get a divorce, and he made sure he brainwashed his son about his new faith. At just 12 years old, Edward was a complete religious fanatic. He even wrote a treatise saying that the Pope was the very son of the devil and Antichrist and an abominable tyrant. So let's add this up. He had a wild temper, he played with sorcery, and he wrote propaganda, all before he was a teenager. Do you think it sounds like this kid is going to make a good king? Whether or not anyone thought Edward would make a good king doesn't change the facts. Henry VIII kicked the bucket in 1547 and the 9-year-old Edward became king. After the absolute circus of Henry's reign, no doubt the people of England hoped they might finally get to take a breather. Nope. Edward's reign would be just as chaotic as his dad's, but don't worry, it would be cut short before Edward could do too much damage. There's a reason we call him doomed. One man dominated much of Edward's reign, his uncle Edward Seymour. This was the same guy Henry VIII sent north to ravage Scotland. Ever since his sister Jane married Henry VIII, Seymour had his eyes set on power. And now, it was within his grasp. With his nephew as the king, Seymour quickly proved he'd do anything to increase his influence. As soon as Henry croaked, Seymour started bribing everyone in the court. Greasing palms worked, and Seymour became Lord Protector of England within days. And he set about ruling the country with an iron fist. Edward Seymour was no loving uncle. He wasn't just looking after the kingdom until Edward VI came of age, he wanted the whole pie for himself. As one source from the court put it, he wanted to become the king of the king. For the next several years, Seymour did his best to keep King Edward VI distracted while he ran England into the ground with nearly unchecked power. However, Seymour made countless enemies as the king of the king, and it was only a matter of time before someone came for his head. The longer Edward Seymour held power, the more arrogant and careless he became. Finally, in 1549, he slipped. Seymour's one-time ally, John Dudley, convinced King Edward VI that Seymour planned to usurp his power, and that was all it took. Seymour was subsequently executed for treason, and Dudley took over as Lord Protector. So, do you think King Edward shed any tears for the uncle whom he doomed to a grisly fate? Nope. Edward's reaction was ice cold. Edward was nothing if not precocious, and when he became king, he started keeping a diary of his innermost thoughts and desires. So, what did he write on the day that he had his own uncle beheaded? The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. Cutting off his uncle's head warranted little more notice than a haircut. Turns out having a spoiled teenager as king isn't exactly ideal. Edward's advisors were all too busy struggling against each other for power to actually run the country, and England fell into a dark era. By 1552, chaos ruled the land, and the country begged for a king to rise up and restore order. But Edward VI could not be that king. Just as things were reaching a fever pitch, Edward suffered a devastating blow. In April 1552, Edward VI caught the measles. The disease ravaged the young king's body, but after a few agonizing weeks, he managed to recover. It seemed like the crisis had passed, but the measles was just the beginning. He may not have realised it, but Edward's clock was ticking, and much more pain was on the horizon. So, when the next sickness came, Edward had nothing left to fight it off with. It all began when Edward started coughing in January 1553. Then came the fever. What may have seemed like a passing flu quickly grew worse and worse, until the boy king was a disturbing sight to behold. An ambassador for Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, saw Edward VI during this illness, and their account of the king was chilling. In a letter to the emperor, they wrote of Edward's agony, how he struggled even to breathe as he slowly grew worse and worse. Just a few months before, the 15-year-old Edward VI had seemed a picture of health, and just like that, he started wasting away. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, it seemed like he might get better, but in reality, there was no hope for him now. Edward suffered in excruciating pain for months, but by April he appeared to recover. He felt well enough to leave his rooms and enjoy some fresh air in Westminster Park. By May, Edward seemed well enough that his royal doctors all believed he'd recover in a matter of days. Londoners reported seeing him sitting by his window, watching the ships on the Thames. And it really seemed like this health scare had finally passed. It had not. In fact, the most gruesome part was yet to come. Edward's cough came back with a vengeance, this time even worse than it had ever been before. Charles V's ambassador sent another report, even darker than the last. The matter he ejects from his mouth is sometimes coloured a greenish yellow and black, sometimes pink, like the colour of blood. I'm no doctor, but that does not sound good. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. Between his scorching fever and hacking cough, Edward's once vital body quickly started wasting away. Before long, his entire body swelled like an overripe fruit, and painful ulcers opened up all across his skin. On July 1st, 1553, Edward VI made his final public appearance. Crowds waited by his window to catch a glimpse of their ailing king, but when he finally arrived, the onlookers were utterly horrified. Edward, who had always been so healthy and vital, had completely wasted away. At that point, the crowd realised what Edward's attendants had probably known for weeks. King Edward VI was about to die. Edward's end was not quick. He clung to life for many long months, but by July 1553, he simply ran out of the strength to resist any longer. His legs swelled so large that he couldn't even sit up, let alone stand. That meant he had to spend all of his days lying in bed. But even with every comfort, Edward couldn't find relief. He couldn't keep any food down, and the pain of his sores and his cough was constant. Then, Edward finally reached rock bottom. On one day in early July, a feeble Edward pulled one of his terrified attendants close and whispered a devastating confession. "I am glad to die." Thankfully, after fighting for 6 long months, Edward wouldn't have to suffer much longer. Despite the horrors of Edward's appearance at the window on July 1st, crowds still showed up again the next day. To no avail. They came again the day after that too. The people hoped to catch another brief glimpse of their king, but Edward never appeared. No one would ever see the king alive again. Edward VI's final moments were heartbreakingly tender. As one of his attendants cradled the king's withered body in their arms, he looked up at them and whispered, "I am faint." Then he weakly cried, "Lord, have mercy upon me and take my spirit." With that, King Edward VI was no more. He was just 15 years old. Next, as always happened when a monarch passed, dark rumours about the circumstances of the king's demise began to swirl. For some, it seemed too hard to believe that Edward fell so violently ill so suddenly. One day he was the picture of health, the next he was wasting away. These skeptics pointed to a much darker cause of death: poison. Some claimed John Dudley was behind it, the scheming tyrant who wanted power all to himself. Others pointed the finger at Catholics. In reality, it's far more likely that Edward's end was tuberculosis, or some similar affliction. But no one can ever say for sure. What mattered was Edward was gone. At the very last minute, Edward, who'd been wasting away for months at this point, cut his sisters out of the succession. Then he just so happened to make the Lord Protector's nobody daughter-in-law his heir. Lady Jane Grey was now the Queen of England, but not for long. With Grey's grasp on the throne shaky at best, Edward's sister Mary pounced. They don't call her Bloody Mary for nothing. She made sure everyone who tried to take her rightful crown from her paid a terrible price. Bloody Mary was Henry VIII's own daughter. Lady Jane Grey was Henry VIII's sister's granddaughter. It doesn't take a genealogy whiz to see who has the stronger claim to the throne. Mary quickly rallied thousands of supporters to her cause. With the people at her back, Mary turned the tables on poor Jane Grey. She was just her father-in-law's puppet anyway. Mary convinced the Privy Council to depose Lady Jane Grey, forevermore known as the 9 Days Queen, and declare her Queen Mary of England. She subsequently had Jane and her husband tossed in the Tower of London and accused them both of treason. There, Jane rotted away for the better part of a year before Mary finally decided to get rid of her. Mary had Jane Grey beheaded in February 1554. The more you learn about Edward, the more you realise how much of a bullet England dodged when he passed so young. Edward was a brat to end all brats. And like all spoiled brats, he had a vicious temper. According to one contemporary, during one fit of rage, Edward ripped a living falcon into 4 pieces with his bare hands. Now imagine what that kind of person could have done as a full-fledged king. No, Edward wasn't some tragic innocent figure as history might have you believe. The truth was a whole lot darker. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.